Welcome back to Express. Well, the Prime Minister of Tibet's government in exile is on an official visit to Canada. Dr. Lobsang Sangay is in Ottawa, and tomorrow he will be speaking to a parliamentary committee about human rights.
Of course, Tibet has long been in the news. It is tightly controlled by China, has been since the 1950s. There is a vocal independence movement, and as of this past month, more than 100 people, including monks and nuns, have lit themselves on fire as a form of protest against Chinese rule and to draw attention to human rights abuses in Tibet. Many of them died as a result. Tibet's government in exile is based in neighboring India, and joining us now is Dr. Lobsang Sangay, Tibet's Prime Minister. Mr. Prime Minister, what's your message to the Canadian government about what is happening in Tibet?
Thank you. Good to be on your show. I would like to thank the government and people of Canada for their support for the Tibetan people and urge the Canadian government to press the Chinese government, given how bad the situation in Tibet is, to enter into dialogue to peacefully solve the issue of Tibet. So that will be my request to the government and people of Canada.
You know, there have been at least 104 self-immolations in Tibet against Chinese rule. So what is that a sign of?
It's really unfortunate that more than 100 Tibetans have committed self-immolation, and the causes for self-immolations are very clear. The occupation of Tibet, political repression, economic marginalization, environmental destruction, cultural assimilation, and denial of religious freedom. These are the reasons why Tibetans, without any freedom of speech, are forced to or have entered into a very tragic way of self-immolation. And as far as Tibetan administration is concerned, we have discouraged a self-immolation by Tibetans inside Tibet, but we support the aspiration of self-immolators, that is, return of His Holiness Dalai Lama to Tibet and freedom for Tibetan people.
China, as you know, is a rising superpower. There is now a new regime in place in Beijing. China finds these self-immolations to be politically very embarrassing, of course. Is China getting the message, though?
I hope so. They ought to, because after 50-plus years of occupation, these people, the generation of self-immolators, are what I call socialist paradise generation, because they grew up under the occupation of China, under the Chinese economic system, political system, and they are the quote-unquote beneficiary of Chinese government policies. Now, when they are protesting in such a tragic, sad form, the Chinese leaders ought to know that their policies, hardline policies, are not working, and they ought to solve the issue of Tibet peacefully through dialogue with us.
Tomorrow, you're going to be speaking to a parliamentary committee about human rights. I'm curious, what has Canada's relationship been with Tibet up until this point? And realistically, what can Canada do?
You know, Canadian government and the people have been very supportive. You know, His Holiness Dalai Lama has visited Canada before and been received by many leaders in Canada, including the Prime Minister Harper. And then Canadian government also, and Canada as a whole, has a strong foundation on human rights and democracy, and then this is the core principle on which the Canadian government ought to stand and press the Chinese government that they ought to respect the basic freedom of Tibetan people, and it is their own interest because human rights is equally important to economic rights. So Canada ought to have economic relationship with China, but human rights is equally important. That message ought to be shared with the Chinese leaders.
Our government and our Prime Minister has made trade with China a major priority for the future of this country, and one of his top priorities anyway. Are you at all concerned that economic interests, Canadian economic interests, will take precedent over human rights, and that Tibet will be sort of forgotten in that?
I hope not, and I urge not to do so at all, because trade and human rights are equally important. China is doing business with Canada because the goods that Canada sells is cheaper. If they get a better deal, they'll go somewhere else. But the core principle of Canada and the founding principle in the Canadian Constitution are human rights and freedom. That ought to be respected. So otherwise you will look just like a commodity that can be traded off, in the market. And we are human beings with conscience and feelings and morals and ethics. And then Canadian ought to stand on morality and and ethics on which how to deal in the international community, and also pressed that it is in the interests of the Chinese government and China to be seen respecting human rights of its people, because Chinese government says their foreign policy is peaceful rise, their domestic policy is harmony. If there is no peace in Tibet and there is no harmony among Tibetan people, then what they say and what they actually do will be contradictory. So it is not in their interest as well.
Dr. Lobsang Sangay is Tibet's Prime Minister. Thank you so much for your time, Mr. Prime Minister. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Todd. Good to be on this show.